Hello, my name is Rob, and welcome to Directors Uncut. If this is your first episode, we put filmmakers from all corners of the globe onto a huge list that covers everything from Japanese punk madness to British kitchen sink dramas. Then we turn it into a lottery of directors, and by using a random number generator, we pick a name out of the hat. Whatever name comes out, myself and guest hosts discuss them and their work through two films. This week I've been joined by Graham.
Hello.
And Jonathan.
Hello.
And this week we've got the perfect people for the perfect episode. I'm assuming it's going to fall on a lot of people's deaf ears, but if it allows you to discover some great movies from Czechoslovakia, well, then that's what this podcast is for. And that director is Karel Zeman.
Yes. Now, normally you ask us if we have any familiarity with the director we're doing the show on, but that would be a bit of a foregone conclusion this week, right?
Yeah, I mean, you have to, really. I think most people would be who. I mean, in the clip that I use, well, the clip where we pick who the director's going to be, I've never heard such a massive wall of silence before. I'm never usually the authority in an episode of a certain director, but that one, it's like, the Czechoslovakia, the 60s, the 70s. I think, no, just absolutely nothing.
What are they teaching kids in school these days?
Well, I'm not answering that question. But you segued into it, so I may as well just jump into it. Where did you both first experience Karel Zeman? Jonathan?
I kind of specialise, I guess, in Czech cinema, and I first discovered him in the early 2000s when I was starting to research Czech cinema for like my postgraduate studies that I was doing. And luckily enough, at the time that I'd started to get into Czech cinema and Czech animation, there was a sort of a season, like a touring season of Czech animation that came to the Corner House Cinema in Manchester. So this is about like 2003, I think. And they showed quite a wide selection of Czech animation, and they showed actually Invention for Destruction, one of the films that we're going to discuss. So that was really like my first introduction to him. And I mean, it's interesting. I was reading actually about the way that this film was basically kind of repackaged in the 60s for the American market as I think it was the fantastic world or the fabulous world of Jules Verne. And so I guess for like a lot of people of that age group who would have seen it in the 60s, I guess they wouldn't have known it was Czech and they didn't really have that kind of context. But I guess for me, I was kind of like discovering it in the context of like Czech animation. So I was like seeing this, and then I was seeing like Jerzy Trinka's films and Schwankmajer. And I think it does make more sense, I think, in that context of Czech cinema and I guess like East European animation and this love of like Victoriana and this love of like antique objects and things like that. Because I was also really into like Borowczyk at this time, and Borowczyk, more the sort of animated, but not the kind of later notorious.
Oh no, it's just you two are such peas in a pod. That's
I know,
really.
Yeah, we're going to get onto that later because I do have some notes about Borowczyk.
Just on the case of that, I think it was, I can't remember the director off the top of my head, but Ikari XB1, didn't they repackage him with an American title? When that was released.
Journey to the Edge of the Universe, I think it was something like, There's right. A few of those ones. There's one of Zeman's very earliest films, Journey to the Beginning of Time, has a hilarious American dub where they actually anglicize all of the Czech names. So if it's like Stefan, it becomes Stephen. If it's something like Zbrignu, they just give in and call him Andy or something.
I think Jindřich Polák was like Jack Polak or something, wasn't it? I think in
something like that. Yeah.
Very low effort, but it makes sense, I guess. So Graham, same question to you. Where did you first hear Karel Zeman?
I think I first heard about Karel Zeman from you, Rob, because when I came on board the Geek Show, we just started getting a second run in, and second run certainly in the UK, but elsewhere, because they are a Region Zero release company, have been real champions of Czech and Slovak and other like Central and Eastern European films. So one of the first ones we got through was A Jester's Tale.
Yes.
And I took that home, I'd lent that off you, and I was absolutely knocked sideways by it. And a bit later, after I'd started to watch more Czech films and Slovak films, I always feel kind of bad for the Slovaks for being like the sort of poor relations in a lot of these discussions, even though they've made some of my favourite films of the movement. But after a while, I got a commission from Second Run to do the inlay booklet for Karel Zeman's The Fabulous Baron Munchausen. And that was really where I started properly studying his work and paying attention to him, I think.
Excellent. I can't really compete to either of those. It was just through Second Run, essentially. It's one of those movies, The Jester's Tale especially, it's kind of a light bulb moment, because it's not the sort of thing which you say to really crossover Czech cinema or Slovak cinema. It's one of those things where the Czechoslovakia does movies now. I didn't know about this because it's kind of been just buried by history, unfortunately.
Yeah, Jonathan mentioned Schwankmajer, and I think Schwankmajer is actually kind of an easier sell in English language territories because his work is so surreal. And so when Eastern European animation looks weird, which it often does to audiences outside of Eastern Europe, it's easier to assimilate that because it's being sold to an audience who are expecting something really strange. Whereas a lot of the more child-friendly animation, which in a Western context would be more commercial, is actually quite hard to sell when it's from Eastern Europe, but it's no less great, as we'll find out.
It's that stigma, isn't it, of it all being of a Soviet type, of quite dour and depressive, which just, as Graham said, we find out just is not true.
Absolutely.
In the slightest. So we've got two movies that we're doing. His 1958 movie, Invention for Destruction, which is also called The Fabulous World of Jules Verne, or a bit of a discovery, a late era movie from 1977, which apparently is his penultimate, Krabat, The Sorcerer's Apprentice. So which of those two would you two like to do first?
I mean, I think Invention for Destruction is quintessential Zeman, so maybe we should do that first just to give people who might not have heard of him a grounding.
Yeah, makes sense. So, Invention for Destruction. Who wants to have a crack at what is essentially a loose synopsis for this one, I think?
It's going to have to be a loose one, isn't it?
Well, even the movie acknowledges it, doesn't it? It's loosely adapted from the work of Jules Verne, I think it says in the credits.
I guess I kind of wrote one down actually, kind of in anticipation. Nice. So because I'm very bad at kind of giving synopses, so I like to have something kind of prepared a little bit. So yeah,
I'm very bad at doing synopses as well, which is why I usually just make Rob do it.
He does.
A story that's narrated by a young scientist called Simon Hart or Sheeman Hart. And it's set in the sort of turn of the century world of technological progress and optimism about the future. And we have a great scientist called Professor Rock, who is kidnapped by a group of pirates who are working for a master criminal called Count Artigas. And the plan is to get Professor Rock to develop a weapon that is capable of unprecedented mass destruction. And this will enable Artigas to rule the world. Rock is a scientific genius, but he's very naive and trusting as to his captors and to the uses that they will put his invention to. So he doesn't really understand the purposes for which, they want to use his invention. And so he initially complies with this and develops this weapon of destruction. And our hero, Hart, who is also captured by the pirates, works to foil this master plan. Along the way, he falls in love with a young woman who has been rescued from one of the destroyed ships because this group of pirates seems to fund and enrich itself by using the secret submarine to destroy ships and steal their treasures. So it's really a kind of combination of everything you could want from an adventure movie. It's got pirates, it's got octopuses, it's got amazing ships and hot air balloons, and it's just an absolute kind of feast of antiquated and modern technologies.
Hi, I'm Steve Reeves, and this is Trailers from Hell. Today we're going to look at a movie from the 50s. This is an American kind of mashup of a bunch of work by the great Czech animator Karl Zeman. Karl Zeman had a very specific style that is widely imitated by Terry Gilliam and Tim Burton and many others. He was quite brilliant. He made a number of films in the 40s and 50s in Czechoslovakia, the former Czechoslovakia, which we got to see in dribs and drabs and bastardized forms like this one. Noted film historian Joseph Dante informs me that the original title of this was The Diabolical Invention. But it's a cool conceit. What Zeman does is he takes a bunch of Jules Verne stories, Mysterious Island, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Earth to the Moon, a whole bunch, and he mashes them together. He had a very specific style of combining live action with puppets, stop motion photography, traditional animation, and a great look. He had this wonderful look where he tried to make things look like engravings. And this is all hand done by one guy. It really goes back to Méliès, the look of it. But his movies were wonderful. This is a movie that I saw in theaters as a kid. It blew me away. Because it looks like illustrations. Just as there's puppets. Just had this wonderful feel. Anyway, Karl Zeman is a great unheralded master of animation, great filmmaker who nobody knows now. Ooh, giant octopus. By the way, any film with a giant octopus is pretty good. Gorilla, great film, especially Gorilla Suit, great film. Giant octopus, pretty good film. Look at that, The Fabulous World of Jules Verne. Joseph E. Levine bought this for cheap and released it here, made a fortune. Think Karl Zeman saw any of it? I don't think so. Mysterious Island. Harryhausen did his own version of that. He also, Zeman, made the best Baron Munchausen movie called The Fabulous Baron Munchausen, which if you ever get a chance, try and see it. It's wonderful.
I think the thing you have to acknowledge first when talking about any of the movies where he marries live action with animation is the aesthetic.
Yes.
That is the thing which really speaks loudest in this movie. And I don't really know how to describe this, but it was in investigating, when I was reviewing these when they were released through Second Run, investigating this stuff, that I found out that the technology that people think of as green screen and being a thoroughly modern invention, I think was invented around this time, maybe early 50s.
Right. I didn't know that, but that doesn't entirely surprise me, because you look at how the real characters interact with the animated backgrounds in Zeman films, and you think that it has to be working on the same principle, because I just can't understand how else you could do it. But
it looks better, which is the real witchcraft of how he does it. I just don't know how to describe it visually. The ships have this sort of pinstripe effect, which makes them look quite other and alien when you think of boats, just as a mundane brown thing floating on the water, but nothing about any of his visuals could be ever described as mundane, I don't think.
Yeah, it's sort of... I don't know whether it's literally the case in this one. It certainly is in the case of Munchausen, but the backgrounds in his films are often taken from old lithographs and woodcuts, which are what would be used to illustrate this kind of a adventure story before photographic reproduction was something that you could just do in a paperback book. So everything kind of flows from the genre. I think that's part of what makes them so satisfying.
Yes, I think it was the original illustrators, wasn't it, of like the Jules Verne novels. I think the name, was it Leon Bennett, I think, was one of the names of these illustrators who produced this very kind of fine, detailed illustrations with the stripes, which I guess I was reading about that, and I read that apparently they used that kind of hatching effect because I think with the... I don't know if it's lithography or if it's like woodcut or it's that kind of early printing technology. And apparently they couldn't reproduce grey effectively. Yeah. So the lines were just a way to kind of, and it's interesting because Zeman, I mean, kind of fetish, he makes a big deal of those stripes and those lines. But I mean, at the time in the kind of early, printing technology, those were just a way to kind of fabricate the grey effect. But he's making that a virtue, that what was a limitation becomes a virtue. And Yes, I've never seen as many stripes, I think, as in this. It's just like everything is striped, isn't it? And it's kind of like a combination of effects, because sometimes it's like it's printed, I think, isn't it? It's like actually technically printed. Sometimes it's like it's drawn onto the background. And then I believe that in some cases they actually use like a roller, and they would just paint the costumes of the actors. So it's all different kinds of effects. And that's why, like you say, it's kind of, when you look at it, it's hard to kind of work out, what you're seeing, because there's so many different techniques kind of coming at you.
Yeah, I agree. You can see a bit of that in Journey to the Beginning of Time, which I absolutely love, but it's easier to spot in Journey to the Beginning of Time because the techniques he's using are also techniques that exist in other countries' special effects films around this time. There's a bit of stop motion, there's a large-scale creature puppet, things that we're used to seeing. Whereas in something like Invention for Destruction, it's like, who else is animating lithographs? What the hell?
Well, it served him well. I mean, the influence he had, he's still singular, even with all of his influence that have cribbed from him quite liberally, I think.
It's absolutely true. I mean, you can't really talk about Zeman's animation without talking about Terry Gilliam, who, I mean, this obviously anticipates the animations that he would do on Monty Python's Flying Circus for a start.
I was looking at it again today, and like the final shot, it just occurred to me that the final shot in Invention for Destruction of that hot air balloon kind of going off into the sun. I mean, I'm sure I've seen that many times in either the Python animations or maybe even in two of the movies of Gilliam. I mean, that's just like such a Gilliam-esque, well, I guess it's a Zeman-esque image that Gilliam kind of adopted, really, but it's just so Gilliam, isn't it, that final image, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. And when you mentioned Borowczyk earlier on, there's a short by him that I really love called Grandmama's Encyclopedia, which is also made with those very archaic, very sort of line-heavy illustrations that he's cut out and animated. And I suppose when I watched that, because I was thinking of Borowczyk in the context of him being influenced by surrealism. So I was thinking of the sort of collage novels that Max Ernst used to make, where he cut illustrations out of magazines and created sort of abstract stories with them. But he could have been influenced by Zeman. I'm sure, they'd have known of each other's work.
It's very similar, yeah. And I mean, Grandmother's Encyclopedia even deals with like it's like all about like car racing, isn't it? And I think there's like there's that similar love of like, antiquated vehicles. And I think, I can't remember if there's a hot air balloon, but it's basically the same idea, isn't it? It's just this fascination with, kind of old contraptions. And like you say,
it was the steam train sequence that made me think, that's Grandma's Encyclopedia. Yeah, absolutely.
I don't need to be here, do I? My perception of this one, though, I mean, it's true of any Zeman movie, I think. It's almost too much for one watch.
Definitely, yeah.
I mean, especially with the first time I saw this, it was just so much of a sensory overload. And that's usually synonymous with just overkill, really, in movies. But in this, it's just so much visual splendor going on, so many ideas with the animation that the first time, it's just you're basically a small child who's seeing their first movie for the first time, that real sense of wonder. And as an adult, I've got to say, I don't know anybody else who can really capture that magic.
Yeah, it's funny that the thing that I remember thinking most clearly when I first saw A Jester's Tale, because I was not a moviegoer as a kid. Movies did not appeal to me when I was young, and all I could remember was thinking, I would have got into movies so much earlier if I'd known this guy exists. And it's a feeling I get every time I watch a new Karel Zeman film.
Yeah, it's rare, and so it's kind of hard to say that he's a movie. It sounds like I'm talking down on his legacy, talking down on his craft, but you have to watch his movies twice.
You do, yeah.
It's a necessity, really.
And it's funny because normally when a film is that overloaded, the first thing that it loses is charm for me. Yeah. Like, I feel like if I'm being hectored or shouted at, I'm not being seduced by a film. But these are very busy movies, and they are very charming movies as well.
And I think the storytelling as well kind of creates that effect, doesn't it? Because it's really just like a kind of, the narrative style, it's very like picaresque, isn't it? It just sort of throws everything into the mix. So, I mean, just as it does visually, it kind of does that narratively where, you're kind of just really, you're seeing everything that can possibly happen. So you have like underwater fights, you have like sea creatures, you have like, chases, swashbuckling. It's just kind of throwing everything into the mix, isn't it, as a story as well? So,
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, so you have to be it is a liberal adaptation, isn't it, of Jules Verne, which there's other adaptations, American adaptations, and they feel quite dull, I guess, in a word.
I have a friend who absolutely adores that kind of Victorian sensation fiction, and I bought him a big book of the complete Jules Verne voyages because he wrote a whole series of these. And what you forget is that, like, everyone knows Journey to the Centre of the Earth because that's still a really exciting thing to make a film about. They're going to the centre of the Earth. That's great, but you forget that there are like 100 Jules Verne novels where he was writing about something that later became completely commonplace. You'll read Around the World in 80 Days, and the next one will be travelling in a motor car at 30 miles per hour or something like that.
Well, in this one, it's about making a big gun, essentially. That is the crux of it. He's got a mad... somebody with a lot of money and a lot of power has made a base in a volcano, and he's making a big gun.
Yeah.
That is the plot. But it's not as simplistic as that. It's much more wondrous, I think.
Because I think the original novel is called something like Facing the Flag, isn't it? Or Face au Drapeau, I think, in French. And as you say, I mean, it's one of those that are just kind of forgotten now. And I was reading through the synopsis of that one. And I mean, it's interesting that, I mean, I guess a lot of it's the same, but I mean, in some crucial ways, it's very different. And the ending is really different because I think in the ending of the original novel, it's really a very sort of patriotic, nationalistic message, because I believe the Professor Rock figure at the end, he's actually kind of happy to kind of destroy, these sort of like oncoming ships. But when he sees the French flag, then he kind of holds back, and then he kind of like, blows up himself and blows up all the other bad guys. But I mean, it's a completely different sort of message to end on, really. And maybe that's possibly a reason why it's not as famous a novel now. But I mean, it's nice that I think Zeman made it into a much more humanistic story at the end, I think, than the original.
Yeah. It's the one thing that you can really say is political about Zeman is that he is consistently anti-war. And I'm sure part of that is because it was an easier sentiment to get through the censors at the time. But it is very deeply felt, and it is something that comes up a lot in his work.
It stands him out a great deal, I think. When you look, he's not new wave. He was making things around the time the new wave was a thing. When you think of other Czech filmmakers who've cut through,
I think the closest he gets to the new wave is in Jessica's Tale, which was written by or co-written by Pavel Juráček, who was a new wave writer-director. And there are like flashes in that, which I think could be from Juráček's own films. There's kind of like a more satirical edge, I guess, to that one. I mean, I remember there's the image of there's like a prince who is basically like a child who's like, there's a scene of this child on horseback with this kind of army that he's commanding. And I mean, that is more like the kind of overtly absurdist territory that you would find like in a new wave film. But I mean, as you say, otherwise he's kind of in his own world, really. I think he doesn't really kind of, and which in a way is good because you can't really date the films in a weird way. I mean, they don't really kind of belong to a particular period. I mean, and he's making some of his best work. I mean, like this one is 58, which is really Czechoslovakia. I mean, it has a kind of like a minor kind of like early thaw in the late 50s, which is kind of it's kind of put a stop to, and then you kind of get the sort of liberalization in the 60s. But basically, this is not really a great time for cinema in Czechoslovakia otherwise in the 1950s. And yet he's kind of immune from that, really. And again, in the 70s, I mean, I guess he goes through a different development in the 70s, which we'll probably talk about with the second film. But I mean, he's pretty much able to kind of do what he does, really. And he's not really impacted by politics in the way that a lot of other filmmakers were, I think.
It makes him incredibly accessible on the basic level.
I notice you were talking there about Jester's Tale, and you talk about it in images, which in my experience is absolutely how you remember these films. I mean, so many of the notes that I made when I was watching this are just like, I've written the underwater cycles, and I've just underlined that and put an exclamation mark at the end, because there it is. That's the insight.
The wind-up pistol.
Yes. They're beautiful.
I think it goes back to what I said. You have to watch these things twice because you're just overloaded with these beautiful images.
There's just so much attention to detail too. Like watching it again, I just picked up on just like really like minute things in it, which I mean didn't really have to be there, but it's just this love of detail. Like in the scene where they're showing like they have that movie projector and they're showing those sort of movie images, and there's a scene with like a weightlifter, and you sort of see this very faint shadow behind him on the wall as he's sort of lifting the weight. And I mean, that's just kind of like a superfluous detail that, I mean, somebody had to actually animate and do that, but you don't really need it, but it's just that love of detail and embellishment that he has. Or like the way the light changes in certain scenes where you have those kind of like animated rays or drawn sort of rays of light. And there's little sort of changes in the kind of intensity of the light. And there's just so much there, really. It can kind of make your head hurt after a while, I think.
I think the most impressive thing in it from a realism perspective is the storm at the beginning, which is like, even though every single thing in the frame looks fake and looks deliberately fake, he's not going for realism, but you feel that battering wind. It's a really palpable sequence.
I think, just maybe wrap this one up because there's lots more to talk about with this director. And
you could just keep picking out standout moments for the whole show. It's true. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, especially with his other work too. Yeah.
I think just before we wrap up, I do want to talk a little bit about his attitude to Verne, because Jules Verne was someone he adapted so many times across his career. And I do always find it interesting when directors have a novelist that they sort of click with, like Frank Darabont with Stephen King, like Ken Russell with D.H. Lawrence. And his adaptations of Verne are always interestingly meta. Like, we're introduced to this with Zeman talking about his adventures which are loosely as described in the Jules Verne book, but the camera like pans past a stack of books with Verne's name on the spine at the start of the film. And something similar happens in Journey to the Beginning of Time too, where you've got kids having a sort of journey to the center of the earth style adventure. And they realize that they can do this by reading Jules Verne and saying, oh, well, if they can do it, we can as well. It's quite a sophisticated way of adapting them that's very unusual for this time period, I think.
And it's, yes, I guess it's consistent with the visual style, isn't it? Because I guess it's, it's referring to the actual books, isn't it? In its very form. And it.
Hi! Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to scare you.
I'm assuming you're Aaron.
Yeah, I'm Aaron. Nice to meet you.
Joseph. Oh my God. Oh my God. This is gonna be a good day.
So the reason I've hired you is because I have terminal brain cancer. And I want you to film me to make a video diary for my unborn son.
You ready for this?
Okay. Joseph!
This is called an adventure. We don't know exactly where we're going, but I have a feeling. When you follow those feelings, great things can happen. Don't ever forget that.
Just taking a little step away from this conversation with Graham and Jonathan to set up and talk about what is coming soon on the podcast. Now, usually in this part of the show, we would pick what's coming up next, in next week's episode, I should say. Little peer behind the curtain. We usually use these segments from previous episodes and record them in advance because obviously that is how it is worked out to make it manageable, essentially. But in doing that, we came up with a director. I'm not going to say who it is because that's a spoiler. We came up with a director who has a very, very small filmography, which presented an interesting conundrum because essentially all of the episodes from this to the end of the season, which I think is the first Friday of July, are migrations from Patreon, so moving off Patreon, becoming a completely free podcast. However, This director, with the small filmography, presented a conundrum. What if we went back on Patreon, essentially with the idea of a series, and whenever the director comes up like this one has, who has a small filmography, and doing an episode on them? Because fundamentally the idea here is there is a lot of directors out there. For example, there's Charles Lawton, who did Night of the Hunter, which is a classic movie which I'd like to talk about on the podcast, or modern directors who are actors too. Let's take a stab in the dark. Ryan Gosling, who did Lost River. Gary Oldman, who did a movie whose name I've not committed to memory because it's too bleak, and any sort of talk about it will trigger flashbacks. So yeah, we came up with that idea. It's going to be a podcast that appears not in any sort of periodic sense, more of when one of the directors comes up, we'll do an episode which will be exclusive to Patreon, and it'll go under the name of One Shot and Done. So there's an episode of that coming pretty soon when season 2 starts. But if you do want to stay with the Patreon, we do have other podcasts and other things happening on there. For example, the sister podcast of the show, Pop Screen, has one monthly episode, bonus episode I should say, for your listening pleasure. And that's a podcast that he talks about musicians and their roles in movies, acting, what have you, directing. I don't know if there's any pop stars who've done directing slots other than RZA, and he should never have done that. But yeah, Pop Screen has a Patreon exclusive too. And coming up in the next episode is one that's probably going to be controversial. It's Mark Duplass. Now, Mark Duplass is one of the prevalent players in the mumblecore movement. But if we did 2 movies that were just basically mumblecore, it would be awfully repetitive and not particularly positive. So we do one mumblecore movie in that episode, and for the second movie we did something where he is an actor and producer, because he has done that a lot. And in that we talk about one of the more beloved found footage horror movies. And just a word of the wise before the episode drops next Friday, we aren't particularly nice about it. We could have been a lot nastier. I mean, the first movie we are very nasty about, justifiably so. I think it's one of my only ever half-star reviews on Letterboxd. But yeah, word to the warning there. So yeah, if you like this podcast, please do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts from. Share it with your friends on social media, and tag me if you do that. On Twitter, I am _RJ Simpson. That's _RJ Simpson. On Instagram, it is Directors Uncut Pod, which is the same as the email address. So if you want to fire any questions, compliments, complaints, which is important about next week, email me at directorsuncutpod@gmail.com. So I've rambled enough. Let's jump back into the scintillating conversation with Graham and Jonathan about Carol Zeman.
Ach, ještě nevíte, kdo jsem. Říkají mi Krabat. Nemám už nikoho.
Krabate.
Někdo mě volal.
Přijď do mlýna na černé vodě.
Get the right years. It's 1977. Krabat, the Sorcerer's Apprentice.
Yeah, this was an interesting one, and this is one that Jonathan had suggested. I think we wanted to go with something that was a bit outside of that kind of cut-out lithograph animation style.
You suggested Journey to the Beginning of Time, Graham.
Yes.
So, yes, this is very different to me. Personally, it's one of these strange examples. He is acknowledged as one of the all-time great animation directors, but at the same time, you don't really picture him as directing animated movies. It's always about the integration of live action with animation. And this one, it's pure stock animation.
Yes, absolutely. Like I talk in the Baron Munchausen booklet about how stop motion animation is interesting because it sits on the border between animation and special effects. You know, if you didn't know that Carol Zeman was an animator by trade, you could watch Journey to the Beginning of Time and say, it's a special effects movie. Those dinosaurs are special effects. But Krabat, the Sorcerer's Apprentice, is definitely an animated movie.
Based on a Slovakian folktale as well.
Yeah.
It's funny on this. Yeah, I wasn't familiar with this. It mentions at the start that it's set in Lusatia, which I had not heard of before, and I looked that up to make sure it wasn't some sort of fantasy kingdom, but it was a sort of historic region in Central Europe that's now split between Germany and Poland, apparently.
Yeah, I think it was the territory of like the Sorbian people who I think were like Slavic speaking. It was like a Slavic speaking minority which I think still exists in Germany. And it just is this very kind of small, minority with this language of its own. And it has a lot of these kind of folk tales. And I think the film was based on a novel, which I think is using the kind of folk tale. So I think the novel is by a German writer called Ottfried Prusler, I think. And so I think the novel, I can't remember when the novel was written, but it wasn't written. It wasn't like
1971 it was, yeah. So not too long before this. I mean, you watch the story, and I assume because of its folktale origins, it feels very antique. It feels very authentically medieval, but it was actually, I guess, an adaptation of a recent bestseller, perhaps.
Yeah, the story, it's quite simple on paper. It's about a boy called Krabat, which apparently translates to Croat. So I don't know the geographical and historical significance of that. But essentially he's a representative of a displaced people. It seems to suggest that lots of people like him are just wandering the countryside, finding anywhere to sleep and to survive. When he's sort of accosted, I guess, by a group of ravens who start saying his name and say, go to this place where you shall meet the master. And the master is a unpleasant bugger, honestly, who has a envoy of young children at his employ who he basically turns into slaves as he practices black magic. And he suggests that he teaches them it, but he basically tortures them and they're sort of learn magic by a trauma, I guess. It's really something.
It's sort of like, all of those sort of jokes that go around about Harry Potter with people saying, why does Ofsted not step in when pupils keep dying at Hogwarts? This is like a filmed adaptation of that observation.
Yeah.
And he stages like these challenges, doesn't he, with the pupils, with the apprentices in magic. But the fact that he kind of gets the coffin out ready, beforehand kind of suggests that, I mean, he's not really like doing that as a real challenge. I mean, he's basically just finding a way to kill them, isn't he, really?
Yeah.
Which is horrible, really. The one thing I will notice, just going back to the animation before we go into the real story, is it's quite singular in a lot of ways. The way he animates and designs the animals. I don't think I've ever seen any animals that ferocious outside of, funnily enough,
Ship Down.
Yeah. The dogs, especially at the beginning, the first time we see Krabat, he's running up a tree, and these dogs are just vicious, absolutely vicious around him. I don't know whether he's got some sort of childhood trauma with animals or anything, but he doesn't depict them in the nicest of lights.
He doesn't, does he? It's a very sort of nature red in tooth and claw kind of depiction, and I think it's heightened by the fact that the animation is not technically crude, but stylistically crude. It's very simple. It's about boiling things down to very visible sort of shapes and brush strokes, rather than have this elaborate kind of photorealism of something like Journey to the Beginning of Time.
You don't have any like facial expressions that change, do you really? It's basically there's kind of like a single expression with, I guess, like just occasional variations, like the mouth or the eyebrows or something, but it's basically a fixed expression, which I think works for this kind of very stylized fantasy, doesn't it, really? Even though it should be a limitation, but somehow it works, I think.
I think if it looked more real, it would be unbearably nasty, wouldn't it? I think that's part of the calculation he's making here. It registers as a much harsher and darker story than he normally makes anyway.
Definitely,
but if it looked anything like realism, it would be obnoxious.
I think the only time it flirts with realism is when there's a fire and there's smoke bellowing. I think that's about it. It's like sort of the opposite of Invention for Destruction. Either the only time when it doesn't look sort of real is when there's an explosion. It has that sort of a cartoon, very sort of Warner Brothers early cartoon explosion effects.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I think there are some of those effects like that, aren't there, that do take us back to like the earlier films, like I think the use of water and like you said, like the flames, and there are those little touches, aren't there, where it does seem that suddenly there's something that's kind of three-dimensional thrown into it. And I think my favourite moment, or I think what's the most effective moment like that, is the one, remember, with the sacks, the moving sacks, where it looks suddenly, it doesn't look like a kind of a cutout, but it looks like it's actually like some kind of like photograph movement with like this walking sack. And
sort of very Fantasia-esque,
Yeah. And I think it works well because it's that uncanny, it has that uncanny effect. And it's like the first point where I think it's introducing magic. And so it actually works quite well in the context, really, that it's just slightly different from the rest of the animation.
It's just little touches that I'm not sure quite grasped, maybe, but Krabat, he's in full. I won't use Technicolor because this is quite a muted movie, but he's in full color, and every other a child beside him is effectively like varying shades of blue.
Yeah, and the evil characters are always kind of grey-skinned, aren't they? As if, their sheer nastiness is kind of rotting them already.
Because you wonder, don't you, at some point, is he going to become grey as well? Is he going to sort of become like one of the other boys? And there is something really sinister about that, isn't there? I think that it's like they've lost their souls or something. Something's happened to them. Like you say, they're just like rotting somehow.
It's an odd film in a lot of ways. I think it threw me because it is so unlike Zeman's other work. And I also have to admit, from the title, I was expecting something more like a take on the myth of the Sorcerer's Apprentice that we know through Fantasia, which I guess you can see a similar thematic skeleton, the idea of the sorcerer like transforming people to do his bidding for him, but it's a very, very loose connection, if there is any connection between the two tales.
I think what happened to him, to Zeman, was that I think at the beginning of the 70s, he basically kind of like deliberately scaled back everything. And he, like before, when he was making like the more kind of ambitious films, he was working partly in Zlín and then partly in Prague. He was going to the Barrandov studios. And then I think it was around the turn, I think after On the Comet in 1970, he started to kind of go back to this sort of smaller scale. And I mean, there's a couple of reasons that have been suggested for that. I think one of them is like a political reason, because like 1968, you had the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. Then you have the return to this kind of Stalinist or neo-Stalinist system. And so one interpretation was that he was going back to his sort of smaller operation in Zlín to get away from the kind of away from the kind of political control in Prague. And then the other explanation that's been given is that he was starting to see, films like 2001: A Space Odyssey, and the kind of level of special effects, and then realizing that either that he couldn't compete with that, or that the kind of fantasy, the kind of effects that he was doing were kind of like out of date. But it's never really been settled like why he did this. But it seems there was this deliberate kind of scaling back, really, and this kind of retreat to this sort of smaller context. But as you say, I think in this case it does work, I think, because of the type of story that he's telling. I mean, he made a film before this based on 1001 Nights, and I mean it's a good film, and I mean it's one where you wish that he could have done that in his kind of usual style, with all the kind of like the tricks and things. But I think in this case, because it's a smaller scale story, it does feel appropriate here, I think.
Yeah, I must admit, I don't prefer it to the ones that are less stylistically homogenous. I like Zeman when he's in that kind of Invention for Destruction, Baron Munchausen mode, where every scene seems to have some different visual gimmick. But I do think it's a strong and interesting piece of work, and I think the consistency of the film's mood is really successful.
I hear without a doubt. Quite nihilistic as well, which you don't really expect. Well, it somehow manages to be both nihilistic and hopeful.
Yeah, nice if you can pull it off.
It talks about love can conquer all, but at the same time, the tactics of the master, again, going back to Watership Down, it's very, very unique in the animated space, that setting kids off against each other, manipulating them. Basically, if they say a word out of place to him, he threatens them to a fight to the death, which is fundamentally what he's doing via turning into animals. There's a little bits of body horror in that, I guess, as well, in the way that it first turns, the first sort of transformation into an animal. It really takes some bold swings.
There are definitely shades of Lampwick in Pinocchio, aren't there, that I felt when watching that, and that, that horrible transformation into a donkey. And like you said, I mean, the ending, it does have that kind of like romantic touch at the end that he likes, as in Invention for Destruction. But I find it kind of, in a way, almost pessimistic that it ends with the destruction of magic, doesn't it? It's like there's no more magic at the end. I think the boys basically lose their power of sorcery. And I mean, this is coming from, one of the greatest kind of like cinematic magicians. And I feel there's something a little bit sad and defeated about that ending, really.
Yeah, it's compelling, isn't it? It's sort of a thematic touch where magic is no more, whereas these boys had a home. It wasn't the best home in the world. Their victory is essentially homelessness.
Yeah, that's very true, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, it's one of the things with any kind of science fiction or fantasy story that you can get a rough read on its politics by saying, in the end, who has the power to change things? And the answer in Krabat is really no one, I guess. There was someone who had that power, they used it terribly, and now it's all gone.
Yes, which is probably very political if you chose to dig down deep into it.
Yes, yeah.
Any final thoughts before we talk about Zeman in broader strokes, though, and Krabat?
There is a live-action adaptation of this made like about 10 years ago by Michael Kreutz painter who did Summer Storm. It looks like a bit more of a sort of generic kind of young adult fantasy from what I've seen, but it would be interesting to compare it because I just think the story is so harsh. It's so weirdly harsh that I'm fascinated to see how they make that palatable to a modern kind of YA audience.
There's, on this one, though, there's a weird vibe to it where it has to feel like it would be maybe a Christmas tradition movie. I don't know if anybody else picked up on that.
I mean, yeah.
I mean, in England, it's inconsistent now, but the Christmas stories... Ghost stories, sorry.
Yeah.
So this has that vibe about it as well.
Like Krampus or something, isn't it? That's kind of a Christmas tradition, isn't it? That kind of...
I think part of it is like the art style. It's got that kind of medieval illuminated manuscript quality, so you can kind of tie a bit of a thread between this and traditional religion, I guess. Maybe that's part of it.
And there's another one as well, isn't there, that Thick and Run put out? What is it, 3 Wishes for Cinderella? That's apparently a big Christmas one too.
Yeah.
Lovely film, yeah.
Okay. So we have talked about it a lot already, but just thoughts on Karel Zeman and his place in cinema history.
I mean, he is extraordinary, and I think that if he had lived in any sort of freer country, that he would be remembered as one of the pioneers and visionaries of animation.
Yeah. I mean, just looking at the people that he's influenced, Wes Anderson, Tim Burton, Borowczyk, who else is there? Terry Gilliam. It's some big names there who are all not acknowledging him openly.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think even Ray Harryhausen, has mentioned, I think he did mention his admiration for him. So I think even there, which you assume to be more that they were in parallel, but I think Harryhausen did see, Journey to the Beginning of Time, and I think he said he was actually a fan of that. So yeah, I think he is he's kind of like an eminence grise, I think, really in cinema or in animation.
I love his relationship, which we've touched on a bit in both of these reviews, but his relationship with realism, that if you look at his early shots, if you look at something like Inspiration, you realise that he could absolutely replicate the natural world by about his sort of fourth or fifth short film.
Just on inspiration, I think that's in the DVD or Blu-ray for this, is it not?
I think it's on Invention for Destruction. Yeah, I think it's an extra.
It is one of the all-time great short movies, without a shadow of a doubt. Yeah.
But it sort of leaves you with a problem, doesn't it? Because like inspiration, part of the point of inspiration is that it's got all of the things that you can't do in stop motion. It does water, it does floating objects, it does steam and smoke, and it does it perfectly. So it gets to the point where you're about to do your first film and you think, oh, what have I got left to do? And the answer increasingly is that he goes further and further into deliberate unreality and stylization, which is part of what makes the film so exciting, I think.
It's the charm of the kind of like the obvious artifice, isn't it? And I think, and the charm of like the handmade as well, I think, because I think that for me is one of the things that makes him so wonderful. That, I mean, it's basically one person, albeit with, I mean, a very talented, crew of people, but there is that kind of personal sensibility there. There's that personal touch, and there's that love of like antiquated objects, and it's really a romantic sensibility that I think has kind of disappeared, or is kind of not really present anymore. So yeah, for me, it's the what they call in the Czech Republic golden Czech hands. He is like the ultimate like icon, or he is the he is the best example of golden Czech hands in cinema, I think.
Hey guys, Graham here.
Graham, he's a fod. He would do anything if he thought it would make people laugh or advance his persona or whatever.
He's an arsehole, but he's my arsehole.
But yeah, I was going to be answering your questions as they came in, but... Aaron?
Obviously, I've seen a lot of paranormal activity in my time.
Aaron convinced me to come back to investigate the ghost.
This alleged ghost that exists in his flat.
There's something definitely weird going on, right? I've been doing this job for 10 years. I've never seen anything quite like that.
The fact that anyone over the age of 5 thought these hauntings were real sums up what's wrong with society today.
Okay? It was you. No! You're losing it, man.
The fact that they were presenting it as real. There were some people that really bought it, and it really hurt them.
Oh my God! It's okay, just keep filming. Thank you. Oh. Who's to say what's real, what's not?
So that brings us to the end of the show, in which where we talk about some of the other movies that we've been watching besides Lords of Carol Zeman's. And just to clarify, we are being quite liberal with this section. It doesn't have to be unique to movies. If you've been watching a TV show, I mean, we've been talking about Taskmaster, it seems like every episode recently. So there's that. Quite open-ended, this part of the show.
Well, I can jump in first if that's okay. Because I like to put in a little plug for something that I've been doing elsewhere, and on Pop Screen, the other podcast that the Geek Show puts out that I run, Sarah and I recently reviewed Eliza Hittman's Never, Rarely, Sometimes, Always, which has really knocked me sideways, I think, because I'd heard great things about it, but it is a movie about a 17-year-old girl crossing state lines to try and get an abortion without her parents finding out, and it came out like in the first summer of the pandemic, and my immediate response was, all right, but I'm already depressed. I don't need the assistance here.
It's also become incredibly, much more relevant, really, hasn't it?
God, absolutely. Yeah, we recorded that podcast on the day that it was leaked that the American Supreme Court was planning to rule Roe versus Wade as not being a constitutional right, and you just thought, oh God, that's like the worst possible time you could be watching it. But I think the power of the film just sort of shines through. It's one of those very unfussy films where nevertheless, as you're watching it, you think, even though this appears quite casual and naturalistic, every image counts, every line of dialogue means something. There isn't a second wasted in the whole film. And it has this lead performance by Sydney Flanagan, who never acted before, and she is just extraordinary in it. She carries the whole thing. It's one of those movies, I always think of it as being kind of in the Carl Dreyer tradition, where so much of it is just close-ups. And if you have a lead actor who cannot convince you that they are the character when you're right up in their face, and most actors can't, it's a hard technique to master. If that doesn't happen, the whole movie falls to pieces. And I was just gripped and riveted by it. I thought it makes all of its political points with humanity, rather than ideology at the forefront. And Hitman is just an extraordinary storyteller, I think.
Okay. Jonathan, anything to follow that?
One film I caught up with recently that I'd never seen before is Bertolucci's 1900, which is something that I'd always wanted to see. And I'm a big fan of Bertolucci, but I just never found, a copy of it.
One.
Yeah, exactly.
all 5 hours of it, yes. It's
that's
quite
right.
undertaking.
Although I watched it over a weekend, I thought, if you're going to watch it, it's best just to kind of like do the whole thing. I'm kind of weird because I'll often like split up like a kind of 90-minute movie, but like when it's like a 5.5 hour one, I'll try, because I just know that I'm not going to, I'm probably not going to stick it out if I split it up. So I tried to watch it. I ended up watching it in 2 sittings, I think, which I think was quite an achievement for me, really. But I'm a big fan of The Conformist. I think The Conformist is one of my favorite films. And so I'd always been keen to see like what he did in this, because this is another film about Italian fascism. And I guess another film about the kind of connections between sexuality and fascism. And also I'd always been curious to see what he did with De Niro and Depardieu in the same film. And I really liked it. I mean, I would say probably it hasn't kind of topped The Conformist in my opinion, but I think it, for me just represents the kind of cinema that, you would never see anymore, because, you have like A-list Hollywood actors, you have this epic scale and sweep, but you also have this, quite obviously kind of like, pro sort of Marxist sort of revolutionary sentiment there, and this very explicit sexuality, which I was really not quite expecting really. And so, I guess it just, another of those films that just makes me nostalgic for a time that I didn't really live in. So, I was really quite impressed by it, I think.
It's De Niro off the back of Taxi Driver as well, so you couldn't really have a better actor at a better time to do anything with.
That's right.
I'm not a fan of that one. I remember doing that in a podcast before, and I sort of like blacked out in rage in 5 minutes later.
It divides opinion, doesn't it? I think it divides.
Yeah. It's hard to justify that sort of running time for anything, I feel.
And I can kind of see what he was trying to do. I mean, I've been watching a lot of like Miklos Janšo films. And I mean, although it's very different from Janšo, I think he's trying to do a similar thing of like, using sort of like, using like specific characters to embody like historical forces. And I think a lot of it's kind of like allegory really, but I think the effect often comes off more as like a bit soapy. There is a kind of like a soapy, which maybe the length also kind of creates that impression too, really. So I can understand. I
don't think he's as good a director as Janšo, but I can understand why somebody would like it. I don't, honestly. Bringing the tone down altogether, I have to represent the horror, I think.
Of course, yeah.
One of my greatest weaknesses in horror is the found footage. I think it was around the time the movie called Apollo 13 came out, in which it had the conceit of found footage is somebody's holding the camera at all times, so you were in the horror. And that one is set on Mars, on the moon, sorry. And it's why we don't go back to the moon anymore. And it's just one of those things where it says, come on, you're just being silly with the idea of somebody holding the camera now. And I just sort of checked out completely of that whole phase.
Yeah.
It's probably bad on my behalf, but, when you just hit rock bottom, you think, you sometimes just have to get out of the building, I think.
Yeah.
So I watched Death of a Vlogger from Graham Hughes up in Glasgow. Interesting movie because it is not what I expected it to be. It plays out much more in line with a Ghostwatch or a Lake Mungo. It's presented as a documentary. In this case, it's about a vlogger who essentially presents himself as somebody who'll do anything for the clicks. And one day he flukes upon getting a great run by having ghosts and ghostly things happen. And it touches upon whether it's fake, whether it's real. Talks about the fragility of social media personalities, which is very interesting, I think. But also, it scared me good. It did me good, I think. Nice. And I think the reason, generally, I do think found footage is just the scariest aspect of horror, because you don't have editing to save you. When you think this movie's scary, you think, oh no, but there's a cut there. But there's music over there, which is kind of removing you from what's happening on screen. But being in the heart of it, with no editing, with no score, except one diegetic stuff, which is actually in the scene, I think it just heightens it completely. And there's a gag here with him leaning against the wall, which I squealed like a little girl, so it doesn't happen often. But when it does, it's exhilarating. But yeah, it's a really good Death of a Vlogger, and it's just championing that micro-budget stuff, production method. And I think it's free on what was previously called IMDb TV, but I don't know what it's called now, like 3V or something. It's a silly name. So yeah, Death of a Vlogger. Who else has anything?
Well, I recently made the inexplicable decision to dive back into Nicholas Winding Refn's series of Restored.
Is that a filling still? Wow.
It's still going. Yeah, he's not going to back down. If he stops doing it, he might have to make another film, and he's probably not going to do that either. I don't know, but I'd had bad experiences with that range of films before, but I decided to watch a film which is it's decorously known by the title The Girls on F Street, and is also known by the title The Maidens of Fetish Street, which gives you more of an indication of what you're in for here. I was curious about it because it's set in the 1920s, which I think for a 1960s exploitation film is weirdly ambitious. And I'm not sure the 20s setting really impacts it all that much, but I will say it, like, if you discount the sort of punk era exploitation stuff that's on that site, this is probably the best thing I've seen on By NWR. It is a very strange film. It follows no earthly rules of screenwriting or story construction. It is basically a series of very anxious, very, very sweaty. It's a very sweaty film. These sweatily anxious set pieces about men going mad with lust or becoming obsessed with the local stripper, or a lesbian relationship that plays out at a sort of absurd level of high-strung psychosexual cod Freudian nonsense. It's one of those things where it's not exactly good, but there's a level of craft to it, and there's a sort of weird intensity to it, which I think it's kind of what you want when you go into an absolute no-budget trash film like this. You want something that is a bit psychedelic and feels a bit like it was made by madmen, and normally they can't deliver that. Normally the poster promises you that, but the film itself is just clunky and dull. But this is authentically really weird. The director is Saul Resnick, who never made another film by himself, though he did. He had the unusual distinction of producing some of Ed Wood's later films.
There you go.
Yeah. He actually took over directing one when Ed's alcoholism put him out of the game. And although I think it's technically a more adept film than anything I've seen of Wood's, there are no glaring continuity errors, which is nice. But if you think of something like the voiceover on Glen or Glenda, where it has this absolutely inexplicable cod mystical element that makes no sense within the film at all. It is a bit like that, and that's my favourite aspect of Ed Wood's stuff, so I was very happy with that.
Okay.
Wow.
Jonathan, anything else?
I don't think I can top that, actually.
I have watched Doberman recently, because that's had its, I think, 20-something, 25th director.
Yeah.
Very, very early era for Vincent Cassel. One of the first movies he did after The Hern, really. Directed by Jan Koonin, and this is something. It's a French movie in the 1990s with Le Hern at sort of the peak of his fame. I thought, rather naively, that it was going to be a bit more classically French in what it did. I was almost entirely wrong. He plays in the first scene, he's getting baptized as a baby, and a Doberman runs in, and one of the gangsters who's at the baptism says, "Oh, this baby should have a gun. It should be his first gift." So the gun gets knocked out of that guy's hand and flies through the air as the Doberman runs in, and lands in the crib for the baby. And it's about at that level of subtlety from all of it, really. Imagine a 1990s Hong Kong action movie done in France by people who didn't really understand the Hong Kong action scene. And it's just that it's basically headache cinema, really. I don't know whether I can do these sort of movies anymore. They were very much of an era, really, weren't they? I mean, I think at the time it was compared to Quentin Tarantino, and whoever said that hasn't seen a Tarantino movie and they haven't seen this. Because I say sometimes when a movie is just so full on, it's cocaine cinema.
Yeah.
Because there's no other phrase to embody it, really. And I think Doberman is peak cocaine cinema.
I think when I watch an action film from that kind of late 90s, early noughties era, the main thing I'm hoping for is some absolutely shocking CGI.
Yeah, it
doesn't
opens.
deliver.
It opens with a CGI Doberman.
Excellent.
A sort of anthropomorphized CGI Doberman. It's just awful. So, it's not all French movies are classy and traditionalist. Some of them are just nuts, I guess.
Yeah, it's not exactly Eric Romer, is it?
Oh, no. No, it certainly isn't. But I think that's it, isn't it? So, Jonathan, where can we find you and your work?
So I did a commentary recently for Miklos Jančo's The Red and the White, and this is available now from Kino Lorber. It's actually being sold in a sort of a single edition with Jančo's first film, The Roundup, and then it's also on a box set of 6 films as well. And I also did an essay recently for Second Run's release of Coach to Vienna, which is a fine kind of revenge drama / sort of strange fairy tale type film set in the Second World War. And a bit more sort of academically, I have a piece about Czech cult cinema, which is going to hopefully come out in a book collection about global cult film next year from Bloomsbury Press. And one of the things it's going to address actually is whether we can even speak about a Czech cult cinema, whether such a thing existed under communism in Czechoslovakia. So hopefully that will be out next year from Bloomsbury.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Look forward to that. Graham, same question to you.
Every week, as I've mentioned a while ago, I host Pop Screen, the Geek Show podcast about movies either starring about or by pop stars with a rotating cast of guests. I also write regular DVD and Blu-ray reviews for the Geek Show, and I also write for Horrified.com, the British horror website.
Excellent. And I have been your host, Rob Simpson, and that was Directors Uncut.